There is a clay tablet in the British Museum in the Mesopotamian Gallery that catalogues what happens to the human soul after death. It is one of 12 tablets excavated by Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s from the ruined library of an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal, whose reign ended in the late 7th century BCE. The tablet is small. It fits in the palm of one hand. The cuneiform covers both sides in dense vertical columns. When scholars first translated the 12th tablet in the late 19th century, what they found was not a story, it was a list. A man named Enkidu, returned from the netherworld, is questioned by Gilgamesh, and one by one he names the categories of the dead. He describes 6 fates. He describes the dead whose bodies burned in fire and whose smoke went up to heaven. He describes one strange 4th category, the dead who do not remain dead, the dead who come back, but never as themselves. It is called Tablet 12 of the Gilgamesh epic, and what happens when you read it against the older Sumerian descent texts is one of the strangest stories in ancient religion. The tablet itself was inscribed in Akkadian, in the standardized cuneiform script used across the Neo-Assyrian Empire, in approximately the 7th century BCE. That is the date of the physical object. The text it carries is older, much older. Tablet 12 is a translation. The Sumerian original it derives from is a poem called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, sometimes called Bilgams and the Netherworld, after the Sumerian form of the hero's name, and that poem was already old when Ashurbanipal's scribes copied it onto the version we have. The Sumerian source goes back at least to the Old Babylonian period, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, and the underlying tradition it preserves is older still. It belongs to a body of texts that includes Inanna's descent to the Netherworld, recovered from the temple library at Nippur. It includes the shorter Akkadian version known as the Descent of Ishtar, also from Ashurbanipal's library. It includes Dumuzi's Dream, an old Babylonian Sumerian composition that describes what happens to Inanna's husband when the demons of the underworld come to claim him, and it includes scattered references in the death of Ur-Nammu, the death of Gilgamesh, and a wide body of incantation and lamentation literature. When you read these texts side by side, and the Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 4 decades cataloguing the tablets at the University Museum in Philadelphia, was among the first to do so systematically, a structure emerges. The structure is not a story. The structure is a system. The Mesopotamian afterlife is not a single undifferentiated dust. It is a sorted set of outcomes. Enkidu names them in Tablet 12. Inanna's descent illustrates one of them in the act of happening. Dumuzi's Dream illustrates another. The Descent of Ishtar repeats the central mechanism in compressed form. The Lamentations describe the consequences. Taken together, the 6 categories preserved in these texts describe what the earliest known civilization on Earth believed happened to the soul after death. The first pathway is for the honoured dead, those buried with care whose sons offer water and bread at the family grave. They eat well in the underworld. The second is for the unburied, those whose bodies were left in the open, whose names no one speaks. Their spirits, called Etemu in Akkadian, return to the world of the living as restless ghosts. They afflict the people who failed them. The third is for those who died in fire. Their bodies do not enter the underworld at all. Their smoke went up to heaven, the tablet says, and that is the end of them. The fourth, and this is the strange one, is for those who do not stay dead, whose souls return, but not as themselves. They return only by trading places with someone else, who must descend in their stead. The fifth is for the stillborn, the eunuchs, the unmarried, the people who fell outside the normal categories. They have an in-between fate. The sixth is for the heroes and kings, the ones whose parents performed every rite, whose personal god embraced them at the threshold. This analysis has been published in fragments across the Assyriological literature for over half a century. It has not been refuted. No counter-system has been proposed, and the fourth category remains the most discussed and the least explained. If you find that the academic literature on the Mesopotamian afterlife has been incomplete, if you suspect there is a coherent system in these tablets that mainstream Assyriology has read in fragments rather than as a whole, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The mainstream Assyriological reading of these texts is careful, sober and broadly accurate. It is also, by the discipline's own admission, incomplete. The orthodox position holds that Mesopotamian eschatology was overwhelmingly singular. There was one destination for the dead. The Sumerians called it the Kur, a word that originally meant mountain or foreign land and which over time came to mean the underworld. The Akkadians called it Akala, or simply the land of no return. It was a single dreary place beneath the earth, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal. The dead drank brackish water, ate the dust of the floor, and remained there for eternity. There were no branching paths. There was no judgment of the soul in the Egyptian sense. There was no transmigration in the Indian sense. The dead descended, and the dead stayed. This is the reading you will find in Stephanie Dalley's Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press in 1989 and revised in 2000. It is the reading in Thorkild Jacobson's The Treasures of Darkness, published in 1976 by Yale University Press, the standard one-volume treatment of Mesopotamian religion. It is the reading in A. Leo Oppenheim's Ancient Mesopotamia, the foundational textbook of Assyriology. These are not fringe positions. They are the consensus of the field, established over more than a century of patient cuneiform scholarship. Within this conventional reading, Tablet 12 of Gilgamesh is treated as something of a curiosity. It was added to the standard Babylonian epic relatively late, in the first millennium BCE, and it does not follow the narrative of Tablet 11. In Tablet 11, the hero has returned home and the story has resolved. In Tablet 12, the story restarts. Enkidu is somehow alive again, descends to the netherworld to retrieve some objects, becomes trapped there, and is finally allowed to speak to Gilgamesh through a crack in the ground. The mainstream view is that the 12th tablet was appended by scribes who wanted to attach an older Sumerian poem to the canonical epic, and that the list of fates Enkidu describes is essentially a funerary catechism, a teaching text about why proper burial matters, presented in the form of a dialogue between two famous heroes. The descent texts, Inanna's descent and its Akkadian counterpart, are read in the conventional framework as etiological myths. They explain why certain festivals occur when they do. They explain why Dumuzi is lamented in the heat of summer. They are read alongside the seasonal cycle of Mesopotamian agriculture. In this reading, Dumuzi is a shepherd god whose absence corresponds to the dry season, and whose return corresponds to the new vegetation. He is, in the famous formulation of the British anthropologist James George Fraser, a dying and rising god of the same general type as Adonis, Attis, and Osiris. That framework has not aged well. By the late 20th century, scholars including Jonathan Z. Smith at the University of Chicago and Mark Smith at New York University had systematically demolished the universal dying and rising god category. The category, they argued, was an imposition of Christian theology onto an unrelated body of ancient evidence. The dying and rising god, as a coherent ancient archetype, did not exist. This was good scholarship. It cleared away decades of bad comparative method. But the rollback was, in some respects, too thorough. In rejecting the universal archetype, it left the actual Mesopotamian substitution theology, which is textually attested, internally coherent and quite different from the Freserian myth, without a clear interpretive home. The conventional reading of the Sumerian descent text is, today, that they describe a substitution mechanism specific to Inanna and Dumuzi. They do not, in the conventional view, describe a generalizable fate for human souls. That is the conventional reading, and the question is whether it accounts for everything in the texts. The break in the conventional reading came slowly, across 3 generations of scholarship, and it has not yet been integrated into a single published synthesis. The first generation was Samuel Noah Kramer. Kramer was born in 1907 in what is now Ukraine, emigrated to the United States as a child, and spent his career at the University of Pennsylvania's University Museum, working on the largest single collection of Sumerian tablets in the world. The Nippur collection at Penn contained thousands of fragments, many uncatalogued, many never published. Kramer's life work was to translate them. He published his Sumerian mythology in 1944, his history begins at Sumer in 1956, and a long series of more technical papers in the journal Iraq, in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, and in the Proceedings of the Rencontre Assyriologique Internationale. Kramer was the first to publish a complete reconstruction of Inanna's descent to the netherworld in 1937, and to revise it across multiple editions as new fragments were identified. He was also the first to systematically argue that the descent texts in Tablet 12 of Gilgamesh belonged to a single coherent body of underworld theology, rather than to disconnected literary traditions. He did not himself articulate the six-fate system in those terms, but he laid the textual groundwork that made the system visible. The second generation was Thorkild Jacobsen. Jacobsen was a Danish-American Assyriologist who taught at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, and at Yale. His book The Treasures of Darkness, published in 1976, is the most influential single treatment of Mesopotamian religion as a systematic intellectual whole. Jacobsen was not interested in cataloguing myths. He was interested in reconstructing what the Sumerian and Akkadian theologians actually believed, what their categories were, how their categories connected, what their underlying view of the universe was. It was Jacobsen who insisted that the substitution mechanism in Inanna's descent was not a folkloric oddity, but a theological proposition. Inanna ascends from the netherworld. The Gala demons of the underworld follow her. They demand that someone descend in her place. The narrative makes clear that this is not optional. The Kur in this theology conserves its souls. You cannot simply leave, you can only trade. Inanna offers the demons two of her cult attendants. They refuse. These attendants are properly mourning her, and so they are protected. She then offers them Dumuzi, her husband, who is sitting on his throne in fine clothing, not mourning. The demons take him. Later, Dumuzi's sister Geshtinana offers to share his fate. 6 months below, 6 months above, alternating. The agreement is recorded in the closing lines of the Sumerian poem. Jacobsen read this as a precise theological statement. Return from the netherworld is possible. It is not, however, possible without a substitute. The one who returns trades places with another. The cycle of substitution is what keeps the underworld balanced, and the implication, never made explicit in any single text but embedded across the corpus, is that this mechanism is not unique to gods. It is available, in attenuated form, to human beings as well. The third generation is more recent. It includes the work of Joanne Scurlock, whose monograph Magico-Medical Means of Treating Ghost-Induced Illnesses in Ancient Mesopotamia, published by Brill in 2006, catalogues the Mesopotamian beliefs about the Atemu, the ghost that returns to the world of the living when the dead are not properly buried. Scurlock's work establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, that the second pathway in our six-fate system was a real and operative theological category. The unburied dead were believed to return as restless spirits, and the ritual literature describes elaborate procedures for sending them back. It includes the work of Tryggve Mettinger of Lund University in Sweden, whose book The Riddle of Resurrection, published in 2001, partially rehabilitated the dying and rising god category for a small number of specific Near Eastern deities, including Dumuzi. Mettinger does not endorse the Fraserian universal archetype. He argues, more narrowly, that certain Mesopotamian texts do describe a deity who dies and is brought back through substitution, and that this should not be conflated with the broader Fraserian model. And it includes the work of Walter Burkert at the University of Zurich, whose book The Orientalizing Revolution, published in 1992 by Harvard University Press, demonstrates the substantial influence of Near Eastern religious thought on early Greek mythology, including, with high probability, the influence of the Inanna-Dumuzi cycle on the Persephone-Hades story. None of these scholars are fringe figures. Kramer was a member of the American Philosophical Society. Jacobsen was a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a winner of the MacArthur Fellowship. Scurlock has published with Brill, with Eisenbrauns, and with the Society of Biblical Literature. Mettinger held a chair at one of the oldest universities in Scandinavia. Burkert was one of the most distinguished classicists of the 20th century. The break, then, is not a single dramatic discovery. It is a slow accumulation of textual evidence, distributed across decades of careful work, that has not yet been gathered into a single published synthesis. The six-fate system can be read out of the Mesopotamian corpus by anyone who reads the corpus carefully. It has not been formally proposed as a system in any monograph this writer has been able to locate. The methodology required is straightforward. You read Tablet 12, you read Inanna's Descent, you read Dumuzi's Dream, you read the Descent of Ishtar, you read the relevant incantation literature, and you observe that the same 6 categories of dead recur across these texts, with the substitution mechanism appearing repeatedly as the only attested means by which a soul returns from the Kur. The break is not that scholars have failed to do the work. The break is that the work, done in pieces, has not been integrated into the standard textbooks. The integration is still open. What follows, if this reading holds, is a substantial revision of how we understand the oldest preserved theology of death. The first implication concerns the structure of Mesopotamian eschatology. If the six-fate system is real, if the texts can be read as describing a sorted set of outcomes rather than a single undifferentiated descent, then the standard textbook claim that the Mesopotamian afterlife was uniformly grim is incomplete. The afterlife was sorted. The conditions of the sort depended on burial, on family piety, on manner of death, on social category, and on a single extraordinary mechanism by which the sort could be reversed. The texts are not merely lamentations about the brevity of life. They are an early attempt at systematic theology. They distinguish categories, they explain consequences, they specify the conditions under which the categories can be moved between. The second implication concerns the substitution mechanism itself. If Inanna's descent and Dumuzi's dream and the related Geshti Nana texts are read together, the trade is not a one-off mythic episode. It is a recurring structural feature. The closing lines of Inanna's descent describe an annual cycle. Dumuzi is in the underworld for half the year. Geshti Nana is there for the other half. The cycle does not end. It continues, and the implication, embedded in the ritual literature, is that the cycle can be entered by human beings under specific conditions. The clearest evidence for this is the substitute king ritual. The substitute king ritual is not a literary fiction. It is a real, attested, well-documented Neo-Assyrian practice performed during the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. When the king's astrologers identified a celestial omen predicting the king's death, the king was temporarily removed from the throne. A substitute, usually a condemned criminal, sometimes a prisoner of war, occasionally a member of the court, was enthroned in his place. The substitute wore the king's robes. The substitute received the king's offerings. The substitute was treated for the duration of the ritual as the king. And when the predicted day of death arrived, the substitute was put to death. The omen was fulfilled. The king resumed the throne. We have the texts. The letters between Esarhaddon and his astrologers, preserved in the State Archives of Assyria series published by the University of Helsinki, describe the procedure in administrative detail. The substitute is named, the duration is specified, the disposition of the substitute's body is recorded. The ritual was performed multiple times during Esarhaddon's reign. It was performed for his son Ashurbanipal, the same Ashurbanipal whose library preserved Tablet 12 of Gilgamesh, in which Enkidu describes the 6 fates of the dead. This is the operational form of the fourth pathway. The substitution mechanism described in the descent text is not metaphor. It was ritual practice. The Neo-Assyrian court believed that death could be deflected onto a substitute body, and they performed the deflection in real political time. The king lived because someone else died in his place. The third implication concerns the geography. The Mesopotamian texts anchor the descent narrative in specific named places. Inanna's home temple, the Eanna, was in Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia. Dumuzi's home was Bad Tibira, named in the Sumerian king list as one of the antediluvian cities, one of the 5 cities, according to the prism known as the Weld-Blundell prism, that existed before the Great Flood washed everything away. The Weld-Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, and it gives the antediluvian kings' reigns totalling 241,200 years. Bad Tibira was the second of these antediluvian cities. Its god was Dumuzi the shepherd, the same Dumuzi who was taken by the Gala demons in the descent texts. The Sumerian king list gives him a reign at Bad Tibira of 36,000 years. The Kur, the underworld itself, is reached through specific named gates. Inanna passes through 7 gates on her descent, surrendering 1 item of regalia at each. The first gate takes her crown, the second takes her lapis lazuli necklace, the third her measuring rod, the fourth her breastplate, the fifth her gold ring, the sixth her royal staff, the seventh her royal robe. She arrives naked before Ereshkigal. The geographic logic of the descent is precise. The number is precise. The order is precise. Whatever the texts are doing, they are not gesturing vaguely at an underworld. They are specifying a structure. The fourth implication concerns the cross-cultural pattern. The Persephone and Hades myth, preserved in the Greek Homeric hymn to Demeter, contains a near-identical structural pattern. Persephone is taken to the underworld. Her mother Demeter searches for her. a negotiation is conducted with the Lord of the Dead. Persephone returns to the upper world, but because she has eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she must return below for a portion of each year. The Greek text specifies the number of seeds and the number of months. Persephone spends 1/3 of the year below and 2/3 above. The cycle is annual. The mechanism is substitution adjacent. The mother and the daughter alternate roles. The fertility of the earth alternates with the alternation. The hymn to Demeter dates to approximately the 7th century BCE, the same century in which Ashurbanipal's scribes were copying Tablet 12 onto the standard Babylonian epic. The parallel was first systematically argued by Walter Burkert in The Orientalizing Revolution. Burkert's case is dense and philological, drawing on shared vocabulary, shared narrative structure, and the dense cultural traffic between the Greek world and the Near East in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. His conclusion is that the Demeter-Persephone narrative is, in significant part, a Greek reworking of the Inanna Dumuzi material, mediated through Phoenician and Anatolian channels. If Burkert is correct, and the field has, on the whole, accepted his case, then the Mesopotamian substitution theology was not a local Sumerian peculiarity. It was a Near Eastern theological framework that spread westward into early Greek religion, and from there into the broader Mediterranean. The Eleusinian mysteries, the most influential mystery religion of antiquity, were built on the Demeter-Persephone story. The Eleusinian mysteries were practiced for nearly 2,000 years, drew initiates from across the Mediterranean, and almost certainly influenced the development of subsequent religious frameworks that emphasize salvation through identification with a God who returns from death. The genealogy of that idea, if Burkert is correct, runs through Inanna and Dumuzi, through Persephone and Demeter, and ultimately into the religious vocabulary of the late antique Mediterranean. The fifth implication concerns the role of the king. In the conventional reading, the Mesopotamian king is a political figure with religious functions, the chief priest of the city god, the executor of divine law on earth. In the implication we are tracing, the king is something more specific. The king is the structural substitute for the people. He is the one whose body can be sacrificed in place of the city. The substitute king ritual makes this explicit at the level of state practice. The Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration, makes it explicit at the level of liturgy. In the Akitu festival, the king is ritually humiliated. He is stripped of his regalia. He is struck by the high priest. He weeps and protests his innocence before the god Marduk. He is then reinvested with the regalia and resumes the throne. The narrative shape is the descent pattern in miniature. The king descends to the level of the common dead and ascends. This is not speculative. The Akitu liturgy is preserved in tablets in the British Museum and elsewhere. The substitute king ritual is preserved in the Esarhaddon correspondence. The descent texts are preserved in tablets in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. The pieces are all there. The synthesis is still open. If you want to check this yourself, the texts are available. Stephanie Daly's Myths from Mesopotamia contains complete translations of the Descent of Ishtar and a partial translation of Inanna's Descent. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, hosted by the University of Oxford, contains the full Sumerian text of Inanna's Descent, of Dumuzi's Dream, of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, and of dozens of related compositions. The text is open. The translations are open. The cataloguing is open. The integration is still incomplete. The sixth implication concerns time depth. Inanna's Descent dates to the early 2nd millennium BCE in the form we have it. The tradition it preserves is older. Inanna herself appears in the earliest known Sumerian religious texts, from the 3rd millennium BCE. Her cult centre at Uruk was excavated by German archaeological teams in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and the temple sequence there goes back to the 4th millennium BCE. The substitution theology we are tracing is not a late development. It is among the oldest preserved theological propositions in human history, and the implication is that the question of return from death as a religious problem is not new. It is older than nearly any other question we know how to ask. There is a seventh implication that follows from the others. The Mesopotamian texts assume an ongoing economic relationship between the living and the dead. Kispu, the funerary meal offered at regular intervals at the family grave, is not merely commemorative, it is operative. The dead require it, the living provide it. The texts and the legal codes both record obligations between generations that extend across the boundary of death. A man without sons faces a specific theological emergency, not merely a social one. His Atemu will have no one to offer the bread and the water. He will join the second pathway, the wandering hungry ghosts. The legal practice of adoption, attested across Mesopotamian contract literature from the 3rd millennium BCE onward, has a death theological dimension that conventional readings sometimes downplay. To adopt a son is, among other things, to secure one's place in the first pathway rather than the second. The economic and theological dimensions are not separable. The whole structure of inheritance, of family obligation, of legal personhood in Mesopotamian society rests on the operating reality of the underworld and its sorted fates. The academic response to the 6 fate reading has been, on the whole, silence followed by partial engagement. The silence is the loudest part. There is no monograph that proposes the 6 fate system as a coherent unit. There is no Assyriological textbook that presents it as the framework for teaching Mesopotamian death theology. There is no peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in Iraq, in the Zeitschrift for Assyriology, or in any of the standard venues, that formally argues for the system and submits it to professional critique. This is not because the textual evidence is unavailable. The textual evidence is fully available. Every text discussed in this video is published. Most are translated into English, French, and German, often in multiple editions. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford has been freely available online since 2000. The Akkadian texts are in the State Archives of Assyria series, in the standard editions of the Gilgamesh epic by Andrew George and others, and in dozens of accessible collections. The work of integration is not blocked by any access barrier. The silence instead is structural. Academic Assyriology, as a discipline, is organized around close textual work on individual compositions and individual archaeological sites. The discipline rewards careful philology and careful excavation. It is suspicious of synthetic theological claims for reasons that are largely good. The discipline has, in living memory, watched the universal dying and rising God framework collapse under sustained empirical pressure, and the field is institutionally cautious about new universalizing claims. This caution has costs. One cost is that genuinely textually grounded systems like the 6 fate framework can fall into a gap between the philological work that establishes the individual texts and the synthetic theological work that would integrate them. The texts are known. The theology is not constructed. When the question of integration is raised, the response is generally a characterization, not a refutation. The characterization runs something like this. The texts do not actually constitute a system. They are individual compositions written at different times by different authors for different purposes. To read them as a unified theology is to impose a coherence the texts do not have. The Sumerians did not have systematic theology. They had myths. Myths are not theology. Therefore, the 6 fate reading is over-systematizing. This is the form of dismissal that the asymmetry argument was made for. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The characterization here has not, to this writer's knowledge, been backed by specific textual analysis, showing that the 6 fate categories do not in fact recur across the relevant compositions. The recurrence is observable. The categories are textually defined. Whether the recurrence amounts to a system or to a coincidence of overlapping vocabulary is a question that requires close engagement with the texts, not a general claim about Sumerian intellectual style. Some of the partial engagements are worth naming. Tryggve Mettinger's The Riddle of Resurrection engaged seriously with the substitution mechanism in the Dumuzi material. Mettinger argued that Dumuzi was, in a defensible sense, a dying and rising god, and that the substitution cycle was theologically operative. Mettinger's book was published by the Connectania Biblica series of Almqvist and Wixel International, peer-reviewed, and received mixed but engaged reviews. It did not, however, address the broader 6 fate framework. It addressed only the substitution component. Joanne Scurlock's work on Mesopotamian ghost literature engaged seriously with the second pathway, the Atemu, the unburied dead, the wandering spirits. Scurlock's catalogue is the definitive treatment of that pathway in the modern literature. It did not, however, address the substitution component, and it did not propose that the Atemu category was part of a larger sorted system. The work of Andrew George at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London whose 2-volume edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic was published by Oxford University Press in 2003, is the definitive philological treatment of the standard Babylonian epic, including Tablet 12. George's commentary on Tablet 12 discusses the categories Enkidu enumerates. George does not, however, propose that these categories constitute a system, and his commentary is largely concerned with the textual history of the tablet rather than with its theological implications. The pattern is consistent. The pieces of the Six Fate framework have all been engaged with by serious scholars. The integration has not. There is one further dimension of the dismissal worth naming. The Freserian dying and rising God framework was, as discussed, demolished by the late 20th century. Jonathan Z. Smith's article on the topic in the Encyclopedia of Religion, published by Macmillan in 1987, was particularly influential. Smith argued that the category was a Christian theological imposition on an unrelated ancient evidence base. The argument was, in its specifics, largely correct. The category, as Fraser constructed it, was overbroad. It collapsed important distinctions between different deities and different traditions. But the demolition of the Freserian framework had a secondary consequence. It made it institutionally difficult to make any positive claim about death and return theology in the ancient Near East, without being suspected of reviving the discredited framework. Scholars who do work on the substitution mechanism, Mettinger most prominently, have had to spend significant portions of their books arguing that they are not Freserians. The defensive posture has been, in some respects, more elaborate than the positive argument, and it has tended to shrink the positive argument. A scholar who is preoccupied with demonstrating that they are not making a discredited claim is constrained in what new claims they can make. The Six Fate framework, taken seriously, does not require reviving the Freserian model. It is a more local and more textually constrained claim. It says that the Mesopotamian texts describe 6 categories of fate for the dead, and that one of these categories operates by substitution. It does not say that Dumuzi is the same as Adonis, or that Inanna is the same as Persephone in any deep theological sense. It says only that the substitution mechanism is real, that the substitution mechanism is the only attested means of return from the Kur, and that the broad assorted system can be read out of the corpus. But because the academic conversation around death and return in the ancient Near East has been, for 40 years, primarily a conversation about whether or not Fraser was wrong, the space for the more local and more textually constrained claim has not opened up. The journals of record can be searched. The Journal of the American Oriental Society, the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, Iraq, the Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, the Revue d'Assyriologie, and the Proceedings of the Rencontre Assyriologique Internationale have all been continuously published for at least several decades. They contain hundreds of articles on Mesopotamian eschatology, on the descent literature, on the substitute king ritual, and on the Tammuz cult. None of them, to this writer's knowledge, contains an article that formally proposes the Six Fate system as a coherent theological framework and submits it for collegial critique. The framework can be read out of the texts. It has not been formally put on the record for the field to evaluate. That gap is the dismissal in its operative form. It is not a polemic, it is an absence. To understand why the Six Fate system mattered to the people who wrote these tablets, you have to understand what world they thought they were living in. The Sumerians believed the universe had 3 layers. Above was An, the sky, which was also the name of the father of the gods. Below was Kai, the earth, originally one body with An and separated at the beginning of time. Beneath Ki was the Kur, the netherworld, the foreign land, the place where the dead went. Between the 3 layers ran the cosmic order, the Me, which the Sumerian scribes treated as a kind of operating system for reality. The Me included the divine plans for kingship, for priesthood, for the crafts, for war, for the descent to the underworld and the ascent from it. Inanna, in one of the most famous mythological compositions, steals the Me from her father Enki at the city of Eridu, and brings them to her own city of Uruk. The descent to the underworld is one of the Me, the ascent from it is another. The mechanism of substitution that links them is encoded in the same body of cosmic ordinances. Eridu, where Enki kept the Me before Inanna took them, is one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the archaeological record. The site in southern Iraq contains levels reaching back to approximately the 6th millennium BCE. The Sumerian king list, on the Weld-Blundell Prism in Oxford, names Eridu as the first city of kingship, Before the flood, the prism says, kingship descended from heaven and settled at Eridu. 2 kings ruled there for a combined 64,800 years. Then kingship moved to Bad Tabira, where Dumuzi the shepherd reigned for 36,000 years. The chronologies are mythic. The cities are real. They have been excavated. The flood narrative that follows is preserved most fully in the Sumerian flood tablet at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and in tablet 11 of the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh in the British Museum. The Sumerian version, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity. One god, Enki, warns a king named Ziusudra. Ziusudra builds a boat. The flood comes, Ziusudra survives. He is granted eternal life and removed to a place called Dilmun, on the eastern edge of the world. The flood resets the cosmological clock. Kingship descends from heaven a second time, this time at Kish. The cities are rebuilt, and the descent and substitution theology continues in a continuous cultural line, from the antediluvian period through the dynastic Sumerian period and onward into the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian successor cultures. The continuity is striking. The texts we have were copied and recopied across more than 2,000 years of cuneiform civilization. The scribes at Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh, in the 7th century BCE, were copying compositions that had been composed 1,000 years earlier in old Babylonian schools, which were themselves copying and adapting compositions from 3rd millennium Sumerian originals. The theological vocabulary, the divine names, the underworld geography, the substitution mechanism, all of these passed through that long chain largely intact. The scribes themselves were called Dubsar in Sumerian, Tupsharu in Akkadian. They trained for many years in the Aduba, the tablet house, learning to write cuneiform with a reed stylus on wet clay. The training corpus included the descent texts. A scribe who finished his training would have known Inanna's descent by heart, or at least known it well enough to copy it without major errors. The same is true for the related lamentations, for the Sumerian king list, for the standard hymnic literature. These were the foundational texts of Mesopotamian literacy. The 6 fate framework, if it is real, was not esoteric. It was the basic theological vocabulary of the educated class. The temple system encoded the framework in built form. Mesopotamian temples were not simply buildings where priests performed rites. They were houses of the gods, in a literal sense. The god dwelled in the temple. The god statue was bathed, dressed, fed, anointed, and put to bed by a permanent staff of priests. When the god travelled to another temple for a festival in a procession, the statue was carried with elaborate ceremony. When the god died, ritually, in the descent narratives, the statue was treated correspondingly. There are records of the cult statue of Marduk being removed from his temple in Babylon, transported to Assyria as war booty, and then ritually returned. The return was treated as a divine resurrection. The Babylonian Akitu festival could not be celebrated without the statue present. The Akitu festival was the central liturgical event of the Babylonian year. It was held over the first 12 days of the month of Nisanu in early spring. The liturgy is preserved in a Seleucid-era ritual text in the Louvre, copying material from much older Babylonian originals. The festival included the recitation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which describes the god Marduk's defeat of the primordial sea monster Tiamat and his creation of the world from her body. The Enuma Elish is preserved on 7 tablets, most fully in copies from Ashurbanipal's library. The festival also included the ritual humiliation of the king. The king was led to the temple. His regalia were stripped. The high priest struck him on the cheek hard enough to draw tears. The king then declared that he had not sinned against Babylon during the past year. The high priest restored the regalia. The king resumed the throne. The structural pattern is identical to the descent narrative in miniature. The king descends in symbolic terms to the condition of the common dead. He is stripped of his identifying markers. The same way Inanna is stripped of her regalia at the 7 gates. He weeps. He confesses, or rather denies. He is restored. The cycle is completed. The new year begins. To witness this in midlife Babylon, you would have stood on the ziggurat platform of the Asagila temple complex, looking out across the plain of southern Mesopotamia, with the Euphrates winding to the west and the great processional road, the Ayibushabu, running north toward the Ishtar Gate. The gate itself, with its blue-glazed brick walls and its bas-reliefs of lions and dragons, has been reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin from materials excavated by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey between 1899 and 1917. The gate is approximately 14 metres high. The processional road behind it is nearly half a mile long. The bricks are blue. The blue is not incidental. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone from which the cosmetic and ritual blues of Mesopotamia were made, came from a single source. The mines of Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, roughly 2,000 kilometres from the Mesopotamian heartland. The supply chain ran across the Iranian plateau, through the Indus Valley trading posts, and into the southern Mesopotamian cities by the 3rd millennium BCE. The trade is documented in the cuneiform economic texts. Inanna's lapis lazuli necklace, which she surrenders at the second gate of the underworld, is not a decorative detail. It is a marker of a long-distance trade, of cosmopolitan wealth, of the worldly attachments that the descent strips away. The text knows what it is naming. The descent itself, as Inanna performs it, is described with precise spatial detail. She passes from the upper world through the Ganzir, the threshold of the underworld. She is met by Neti, the chief gatekeeper. She names herself. She demands entrance. Neti reports to Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. Ereshkigal, who is Inanna's elder sister, is enraged. She instructs Neti to bring Inanna through the 7 gates, one by one, stripping her at each. By the 7th gate, Inanna stands naked. She is brought before Ereshkigal and the 7 judges, the Anuna, who fix the death look upon her. Inanna becomes a corpse. The corpse is hung on a hook on the wall. The Anuna are the same group of gods Zechariah Sitchin made famous, in different transliteration, as the Anunnaki. The word means, approximately, the offspring of An, the sky god. The Anuna or Anunnaki appear in the earliest Sumerian texts as the High Council of the gods. By the time of Inanna's descent, they have been assigned a specific judicial function in the underworld. 7 of them sit in judgment, the same number as the gates Inanna has passed through. The structural parallels in the text are dense and deliberate. The poem is not a casual story. It is a carefully constructed theological proposition. Inanna is rescued only because she had instructed her vizier, Ninshubur, to mourn for her if she did not return within 3 days. Ninshubur follows the instructions. She goes to the other gods, beats her drum, tears her clothes, scratches her face. She begs the gods to intervene. Enlil refuses. Nanna, the moon god, refuses. Only Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the same god who keeps the me at Eridu, agrees to act. He creates 2 messengers from the dirt under his fingernails. He gives them the food of the life and the water of life. He sends them to the underworld. They sneak past Ereshkigal, sprinkle the food and water on Inanna's corpse and revive her. This is the only return from death narrative in the Mesopotamian corpus that involves an intervention by a higher god. Every other return, Dumuzi's, Geshtinana's, the implied returns in the substitute king ritual, operates through substitution alone. Inanna's return is the exception that establishes the rule. She returns because Enki intervened, but she still cannot leave the Kur unconditionally. The Gala demons attach themselves to her and demand a substitute. She gives them Dumuzi. The Gala demons are worth pausing on. They are described in the text as having no families, no food, no offerings, no sense of justice. They eat no bread. They drink no water. They show no mercy. They are pure functions of the underworld's conservation principle. They exist to ensure that what enters the Kur stays in the Kur, in some form, in some body, in some equivalent. They are the enforcement mechanism of the substitution theology. The 4th pathway operates through them. The dead who do not stay dead are those for whom another body is given to the Gala. This is the precise textual basis for the claim that the 4th fate sends you back through someone else. The Gala do not care who descends. They care only that the count is preserved. One ascends, one descends. Inanna for Dumuzi, Dumuzi for Geshtinana, 6. Months on, 6 months off. The substitute king for the actual king. The condemned criminal in the place of the Neo-Assyrian monarch. The Mesopotamian believer, if such a category can be reconstructed, lived inside a cosmology where this kind of trade was thinkable, not because death was less final there than it would later become in other religious frameworks. Death was final. The conservation principle was rigid. But because the conservation principle was rigid, the possibility of trading positions within it was theologically available. If a god could trade with another god, perhaps a king could trade with a criminal. Perhaps a son could trade with a father. Perhaps the right rites, performed at the right moment, could shift the balance just enough. This is not modern reincarnation. The substitute does not become the original. There is no continuity of consciousness across the trade. The criminal who is enthroned in place of Esarhaddon does not become Esarhaddon in any inner sense. He is executed wearing the king's robes. His body is disposed of with funerary honours. The king resumes the throne and goes on with his life. The trade is mechanical, not spiritual. The continuity of the soul, in any modern sense, is not asserted by the texts. What the texts assert, instead, is something stranger and more specific. They assert that the death event can be deflected onto a different body. They assert that the underworld's count is what matters, not the particular identity of the body that satisfies it. They assert that the gods themselves operate by this principle, and that the principle, in attenuated form, is available to human beings under ritual conditions. This was the world the scribes lived in. This was the framework they trained their students in. This was the theological substrate from which they understood every funeral, every kispu offering, every Akitu festival, every legal contract that invoked the underworld gods as witnesses. The framework is not a modern reconstruction. It is the reconstruction of what the framework already was. The same structure, with the same key components, surfaces in the religious literature of the early Greek world. The story is the Homeric hymn to Demeter, composed in dactylic hexameter in approximately the 7th century BCE, in the same century that Ashurbanipal's scribes were copying Tablet 12 in Nineveh. The hymn to Demeter is preserved in a single Byzantine manuscript discovered in Moscow in 1777, and now held in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg. It survived in one copy. We came close to losing it entirely. The narrative is this. Persephone, the daughter of the grain goddess Demeter, is gathering flowers in a meadow when the ground opens beneath her. Hades, the lord of the dead, rises up in his chariot and takes her down to the underworld. Demeter searches for her daughter across the earth. She does not eat. She does not drink. She wears black. She withholds her gifts. The grain does not grow. Famine spreads across the world. The gods are alarmed. Zeus intervenes. He sends Hermes to the underworld to retrieve Persephone. Hades agrees to release her, but before she leaves he gives her a pomegranate seed to eat. Persephone eats. She returns to the upper world. But because she has eaten in the underworld, she is bound to it. She must return below for a portion of each year. Demeter and Persephone are reunited. The grain grows. The cycle begins. The structural parallels with Inanna's descent are not subtle. A goddess is taken to the underworld. A search and a negotiation are conducted. The goddess returns, but the return is conditional. A periodic alternation between the upper and lower worlds is established. The fertility of the earth tracks the alternation. The framework is identical in its bones. The specific markers of substitution differ. In the Greek text, the pomegranate seed is the binding agent. In the Sumerian text, the substitute body is the binding agent, but the structural function is the same. Something is exchanged for the return. The return is never unconditional. The conservation principle holds. Walter Burkert's argument, in The Orientalizing Revolution, is that the Greek myth is not an independent invention, but a transformation of the Near Eastern material. Burkert points to the dense cultural traffic between the Greek world and the Phoenician and Anatolian East during the Orientalizing period, roughly the 9th through 7th centuries BCE. Greek pottery from this period shows direct iconographic borrowing from Near Eastern sources. Greek alphabet derives from Phoenician. Greek divine names, Aphrodite from a probable Phoenician source, Adonis from the Semitic word for lord, show direct linguistic borrowing. The transmission corridors were open and busy. The Inanna Dumuzi material was particularly well suited to transmission. Inanna's cult under the name Ishtar was active across the Akkadian-speaking world. Her temples at Nineveh, at Arbela, at Ashur, at Babylon were major religious centres. The descent narrative was copied and recopied. The cult of Dumuzi, under the West Semitic name Tammuz, spread into Syria, into Phoenicia, into Anatolia, and ultimately into the Western Mediterranean. The biblical book of Ezekiel, composed in the early 6th century BCE, mentions women of Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz at the gate of the temple. The cult had reached the Eastern Mediterranean by then. From there to the Aegean was a short cultural step. The hymn to Demeter is not the only relevant Greek text. The Orphic literature, fragments of which date to the late Archaic and Classical periods, preserves a more elaborate version of the descent material. including initiatory rites that explicitly model themselves on Persephone's return. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most influential mystery religion of antiquity, were celebrated annually at Eleusis, just west of Athens, for nearly 2,000 years. The mysteries were initiations into the secret of Persephone's return. The details were guarded, initiates were sworn to silence, but the broad outlines are known. The initiate in the rite somehow shared in Persephone's descent and return. The initiate, after the rite, was understood to have a different relationship to death than they had before. The Eleusinian Mysteries drew initiates from across the Greco-Roman world. The Emperor Hadrian was initiated. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was initiated. Cicero was initiated. The mysteries ran continuously from approximately the 2nd millennium BCE, according to archaeological evidence at the Eleusis site, until they were suppressed by the Christian Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century CE. That is nearly 2,000 years of continuous practice. The mysteries are, by any reasonable measure, one of the most influential religious institutions in human history. And the substance of the mysteries, in its inherited form, is the descent and substitution theology that runs back through Persephone, through Tammuz, through Dumuzi, to the Sumerian descent narratives copied by Ashurbanipal's scribes. The cross-cultural parallels do not end with Greece. The Egyptian Osiris cycle, in which the god is killed by his brother Set, dismembered, reassembled by his sister wife Isis, and resurrected to rule the underworld, shows broad structural similarity. The Osiris myth is preserved in the pyramid texts at Saqqara, the oldest of which date to approximately the 24th century BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the earlier Sumerian descent literature. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian frameworks developed in parallel in cultural contact through the trading networks of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levantine corridor. The Osiris cycle differs from the Inanna cycle in its specific narrative, in its emphasis on dismemberment and reassembly, in its political theology of dynastic legitimacy. But the central proposition is the same. A god dies, a god returns. The return is mediated by a goddess. The cycle is annual or seasonal. The fertility of the land tracks the cycle. The Hittite tradition, attested in tablets from the royal archives at Hattusa in central Anatolia and excavated by Hugo Winkler beginning in 1906, preserves the myth of Telepinu, the disappearing god. Telepinu vanishes from the world. In his absence the grain withers and the animals do not bear young. The goddess Hanahana sends a bee to find him. The bee finds him asleep. He is awakened and returns. The fertility of the land resumes. The Hittite narrative dates to the late 2nd millennium BCE and is preserved in cuneiform on tablets, currently in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums and the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum. The structural pattern is again the same. A god is removed from the upper world. A search is conducted. The god returns. Fertility resumes. The Ugaritic Baal cycle, preserved in clay tablets discovered at Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast in 1928, describes the god Baal's death at the hands of Mot, the god of death, his descent to the underworld, and his eventual return through the intervention of his sister Anat. The Ugaritic tablets date to the 14th century BCE. The narrative includes the dismemberment of Mot and Baal's restoration. The structural pattern is, once again, recognizable. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, in cultures that were in contact with each other across the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, the same framework recurs. A figure descends. A search and a negotiation occur. The figure returns. The return is conditional, periodic, mediated by a substitute or an exchange or a binding agent. Fertility, the seasons, the political legitimacy of the king, the religious experience of the initiate all attach to this central structural template. The conventional explanation for the parallels is diffusion. The Sumerian framework, being the oldest and most fully developed of these traditions in our written record, is generally treated as the source. The Egyptian, Hittite, Ugaritic and Greek traditions are then read as cultural developments influenced by the Sumerian Akkadian source, transmitted through trade, migration, and elite cultural contact. The diffusion model accounts for most of the data. It does not, however, fully account for the structural precision of the parallel, the 7 gates in Inanna's descent and the 7 rivers of the Greek underworld, the pomegranate seeds and the 6-month Dumuzi spends below, the substitute mechanism and the substitution of Pollux for Castor in the Dioscuri myth, where the immortal twin trades half his life for the mortal twin. The structural elements travel together in suspicious configurations. Whatever the precise mechanism of transmission, the pattern is established. The Sumerian framework of the 6 fates, with the substitution mechanism at its centre, is not a Sumerian peculiarity. It is the seed form of a theological structure that propagates across most of the major religious traditions of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. It is, in this sense, the oldest preserved theology of return from death in the human record. It is also one of the most widely distributed. The most serious objection to this entire framework comes from the same scholarship that demolished the Fraserian dying and rising God category. The argument runs as follows. The descent narratives are not really resurrections. They are not really returns from death in any robust sense. They are, more carefully read, descriptions of seasonal phenomena dressed in mythological clothing. Dumuzi is not a person who dies and returns. He is a personification of the agricultural cycle, the lambing season, the brief and intense fertility of the Mesopotamian spring. To read his story as a theology of death is to import categories the original audience would not have recognized. This case has been made most carefully by Jonathan Z. Smith, by Mark Smith, and by a generation of scholars who have grown skeptical of comparative religious universalism. Their argument is not, on careful reading, that nothing interesting happens in the descent texts. Their argument is that the interesting thing is local, agricultural, ritual-specific, and that the universalizing readings of the texts, of which the 6-fate framework would be one, are overreaches. The case deserves to be taken seriously. The agricultural connections in the descent material are real. The Akkadian lamentations for Tammuz are dense with seasonal vocabulary. The dry summer is described as the period of his death. The first autumn rains are described in language that connects to his return. The festivals in his honour track the agricultural calendar. The local Mesopotamian audience would have understood the texts in significant part as descriptions of the world they actually lived in, a world of agricultural precariousness, of summers that killed crops, of winters that fed them. To this extent, the seasonal reading is correct. The descent texts are agricultural, they are also liturgical, they are tied to specific festivals, to specific months, to specific ritual practices. The framework cannot be lifted out of its agricultural and ritual context without distorting what the texts were doing in their original use. But the strong version of the seasonal reading goes further. It says the texts are only agricultural. It says there is no underlying theology of death and return. It says the substitution mechanism is an agricultural metaphor and nothing more. And this strong version is, on close reading, harder to sustain. The substitute king ritual is the difficulty. The substitute king ritual is not an agricultural metaphor. It is a documented political practice, performed by historical Neo-Assyrian kings, attested in administrative correspondence, involving the execution of actual human beings in place of actual monarchs. The ritual cannot be reduced to seasonal symbolism. It is operative, it is performative. It was understood, by the people who performed it, to deflect death from one body to another body. Whatever theological framework supported the ritual, that framework was not merely agricultural. The Gala demons are a further difficulty. In the descent texts, the Gala are not agricultural figures. They are not seasonal figures. They are described as functions of the underworld's conservation principle. They exist to ensure substitution. They have no parallel in the purely agricultural register. They appear in incantation literature that has nothing to do with the seasonal cycle. They are theological actors in a theological story. The incantation literature on the Atemmu is a third difficulty. The Mesopotamian texts on the unburied dead and their return as restless spirits are not seasonal. They describe a permanent ritual problem. What happens when a body is left unburied, when the family fails in its obligations, when the Atemmu wanders. The remedies prescribed in the incantation texts are specific and operative. The framework is not metaphorical. The strong seasonal reading, then, accounts for parts of the corpus but not for all of it. The agricultural and ritual contexts are real and important. They are not the whole story. The theology of substitution and the categorization of the dead are present in the texts at a level that the seasonal reading does not exhaust. The countercase is real and the countercase is partial. The state of the debate is genuinely unresolved. What can be said is that the seasonal reading and the 6-fate reading are not mutually exclusive. The texts can be agricultural and theological at once. The Mesopotamian scribes did not separate these categories the way modern scholars do. The framework can be read as both. The question of which reading dominates, in which texts, for which audiences, remains genuinely open. If the Six Fate framework is substantially correct, the implications for our understanding of religious history are not small. It would mean that the oldest preserved systematic theology of death and return in the human record is not a theology of personal resurrection, not a theology of judgment, not a theology of reincarnation in the Indian sense. It is a theology of substitution. It is the assertion that the dead remain dead, but that the death event can, under specific ritual conditions, be transferred from one body to another. That assertion is older than any of the major religious frameworks of the modern world. It precedes the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. It precedes the Greek philosophical tradition by a similar margin. It precedes the Buddhist and Hindu reincarnation frameworks by something on the order of a millennium. It would also mean that the religious vocabulary of the late ancient Mediterranean, the vocabulary that fed into the mystery cults, into early Christianity, into the broader history of salvation through identification with a dying God, has a longer and more specific genealogy than is generally taught. The genealogy runs through Eleusis, through Tammuz worship, through Dumuzi's substitution, back to the Sumerian descent narratives copied in the libraries of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The Mesopotamian framework does not assert what later frameworks assert. It is not Christianity. It is not Hinduism. It is not Buddhism. It is its own structure and its own answer to the question that every religious tradition eventually asks: what happens to the soul after death? The Sumerian answer, preserved in the descent texts and in Tablet 12 of the Gilgamesh epic, is that for most souls the answer is nothing. The descent is final, the categories are fixed. For one category, the fourth, the answer is that the soul returns, but only by sending another in its place. And that pattern, embedded in the oldest religious texts we possess, has not been formally refuted. The integration is still incomplete. The question is still open. Tablet 12 of the Gilgamesh epic is in the British Museum in the Mesopotamian Gallery, where it has been since Hormuzd-Rassam dug it out of the ruined library of Ashurbanipal in the 1850s. The Sumerian source poems are in the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, in the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and in the British Museum. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford has them online. Samuel Noah Kramer translated them. Thorkild Jakobsen integrated them into a single account of Mesopotamian religious thought. Stephanie Daly publishes the Standard English collection. The work continues. What Enkidu describes when Gilgamesh questions him through the crack in the ground, the 6 fates of the dead, the categories of who suffers and who is at peace, the strange fourth pathway by which a soul returns from the Kur by sending another in its place, is still where the scribes of Ashurbanipal left it. It is on the tablet. It is in the texts. It has been there since the 7th century BCE. The question of what it all amounts to is still open.